Karen Lattimore, the queen of the HOA, screamed, "If the garage is vacant, the HOA has full authority." I didn't argue. I calmly slammed the door shut in her face and left for a 10-day vacation. While I sipped cocktails on the beach, her car sat rotting in the dirt. It wasn't just petty revenge, it was a message. Abuse of power buries itself. If this were you, would you stay quiet or strike back? And tell me, what state are you in? I had just moved into Maple Grove Estates a few days earlier, still unfamiliar with the maze of street, when that afternoon the sight before me made my blood boil. The garage door was wide open, and inside sat a gleaming white SUV, parked dead center like its owner had claimed the space long ago. I froze for a few seconds, then hurried to the front door, determined to get answers. When I knocked hard, Karen Lattimore appeared. She wasn't flustered or hurried like someone caught red-handed, calm, perfectly dressed, with stiffly curled blonde hair and a faint, smug smile. Her voice came out cool and challenging. "If the garage is empty, it belongs to the community." The statement hit like a splash of ice water to the face, arrogant, absurd, and almost beyond belief. I took a deep breath to hold back my anger, though my voice betrayed my irritation. "You're mistaken. This is my house, my garage. I bought it with my own money, and no one has the right to enter it without permission." Karen didn't bother responding to logic. Her eyes swept over me from head to toe, then lingered just a little too long, making it clear the difference in our skin color wasn't lost on her. That look in her eyes wasn't just entitlement, it was something deeper, something ugly. She folded her arms, tilted her head, and said in an even tone, "You're new here, so maybe you don't understand how things work. I'm the HOA president. I protect the value of this neighborhood. If a garage is unused, it makes sense for others to use it." Her words had the sound of civic duty, but the meaning was blunt and bare. If she wanted it, she would take it. I stepped forward, close enough to feel the cool tension between us. "You might be the HOA president, but the HOA doesn't own my home. Don't ever assume my garage is a place where you can park whatever you like." The words landed hard, each one like a nail, and for a moment I watched the smile freeze on Karen's lip. She stared at me a second longer, then shrugged calculated disdain, like what I said wasn't worth registering. "You'll understand soon enough. Maple Grove Estates isn't for people who don't adapt to our standard." That sentence deep, because I heard exactly what she meant by our. She turned, walked steadily toward the SUV, and shut the garage door with a cold finality, as if stamping her authority in steel. I stood at the edge of my driveway as the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the pavement, casting Karen's haughty silhouette as it faded. I knew from that moment forward, life in this neighborhood would be nothing like the polished promises from the realtor's brochure. What should have been a peaceful place now felt charred, tense, and I could feel my heart pounding, like it already knew a long battle had just begun. Her words echoed in my head. "If the garage is empty, it belongs to the community." That twisted logic wasn't meant to be debated, it was meant to dominate. That woman didn't just want a parking space, she wanted to prove that I, a newcomer, a man of color, had to bow to the authority she claimed. That arrogance made one thing certain: this wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a calculated provocation. I stepped into the house and slammed the door shut. In the dim light of the living room, memories of years spent facing contempt and oppression came rushing back. I had hoped Maple Grove Estates would be a fresh start for me and my family, but it was clear Karen Lattimore had no intention of letting me live in peace. I sat down, breathing deep, feeling the tension spread through my body. But I had just moved into Maple Grove Estates a few days earlier, still unfamiliar with the maze of street, when that afternoon the sight before me made my blood boil. The garage door was wide open, and inside sat a gleaming white SUV, parked dead center like its owner had claimed the space long ago. I froze for a few seconds, then hurried to the front door, determined to get answers. When I knocked hard, Karen Lattimore appeared. She wasn't flustered or hurried like someone caught red-handed, calm, perfectly dressed, with stiffly curled blonde hair and a faint, smug smile. Her voice came out cool and challenging. "If the garage is empty, it belongs to the community." The statement hit like a splash of ice water to face, arrogant, absurd, and almost beyond belief. I took a deep breath to hold back my anger, though my voice betrayed my irritation. "You're mistaken. This is my house, my garage. I bought it with my own money, and no one has the right to enter it without permission." Karen didn't bother responding to logic. Her eyes swept over me from head to toe, then lingered just a little too long, making it clear the difference in our skin color wasn't lost on her. That look in her eyes wasn't just entitlement, it was something deeper, something ugly. She folded her arms, tilted her head, and said in an even tone, "You're new here, so maybe you don't understand how things work. I'm the HOA president. I protect the value of this neighborhood. If a garage is unused, it makes sense for others to use it." Her words had the sound of civic duty, but the meaning was blunt and bare. If she wanted it, she would take it. I stepped forward, close enough to feel the cool tension between us. You might be the HOA president, but the HOA doesn't own my home. Don't ever assume my garage is a place where you can park whatever you like. The words landed hard, each one like a nail, and for a moment, I watched the smile freeze on Karen's lip. She stared at me a second longer, then shrugged calculated disdain, like what I said wasn't with register. You'll understand soon enough, Maple Grove Estates isn't for people who don't adapt to our standard. That sentence deep, because I heard exactly what she meant by our. She turned, walked steadily toward the SUV, and shut the garage door with a cold finality, as if stamping her authority in steel. I stood at the edge of my driveway as the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the pavement, casting Karen's haughty silhouette as it faded. I knew from that moment forward, life in this neighborhood would be nothing like the polished promises from the realtor's brochure. What should have been a peaceful place now felt charred, tense, and I could feel my heart pounding, like it already knew a long battle had just begun. Her words echoed in my head. If the garage is empty, it belongs to the community. That twisted logic wasn't meant to be debated. It was meant to dominate. That woman didn't just want a parking space. She wanted to prove that I, a newcomer, a man of color, had to bow to the authority she claimed. That arrogance made one thing certain. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a calculated provocation. I stepped into the house and slammed the door shut. In the dim light of the living room, memories of years spent facing contempt and oppression came rushing back. I had hoped Maple Grove Estates would be a fresh start for me and my family, but it was clear Karen Lattimore had no intention of letting me live in peace. I sat down, breathing deep, feeling the tension spread through my body. Karen stood in front of my garage, her voice loud enough that people walking several houses down turned to look. This is about protecting community property value. Don't let newcomers ruin it. Her words were like knives aimed straight at me, sweet on the surface, filled with contempt. A few neighbors paused, shaking their heads as if they recognized the absurdity, then quickly moved on, pretending to be busy. Others glanced at me, our eyes meeting for a brief moment before they quickly looked away. Their silence didn't mean agreement with Karen, but none of them dared to speak up. The fear of being labeled anti-HOA drove them to take the safest route, act like nothing happened. I stepped forward, my voice firm. Not a single square foot of my home belongs to your so-called community. I don't need anyone protecting property values by stealing my garage. Every word hit like a hammer, and for a moment, Karen's face tensed, but she quickly returned to her usual poised expression. Karen folded her arms, tilted her head slightly, and let out a faint smile, as if I had just told a ridiculous joke. Newcomers always think personal property is absolute, but here, we have our own ways of keeping order, of eliminating chaos. If you don't like it, you can find another neighborhood. She delivered the line with deliberate emphasis, loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly. I could feel the tension spreading. A middle-aged couple walking their dog paused briefly, then lowered their heads and hurried along, as if afraid the trouble might touch them. An elderly woman on the corner sighed quietly, her gaze meeting mine with helpless sympathy. All of it painted a clear picture. Karen had built her power by instilling fear and cultivating obedience. I stood my ground, refusing to let Karen take control. I came here to live, to build a peaceful home for my family, but I won't let anyone walk into my house and call it community property. If that's your idea of standards, then those standards are nothing more than tools to bully others. Karen narrowed her eyes, her lips curling into a cold smile. You can say whatever you want, but at the end of the day, the HOA rules are enforced by us. Go ahead, try to fight it. You'll find out what it feels like when the whole community turns its back on you. She glanced toward the nearby neighbors, her eyes issuing a command. They immediately lowered their heads, pretending to check phones or tie their shoelace. I knew I had just stepped into an uneven battle. Karen wasn't just speaking to me, she was speaking to the entire neighborhood. She wanted to make an example of me, to show that a newcomer, a man of color, had no right to raise his voice. But the silence around me only gave me more reason not to back down. They were tired too, just waiting for someone willing to stand up. I took a deep breath, then nodded slightly. Fine, keep thinking you can control everything. But remember what I say, one day, the people in this neighborhood will learn what real standards look like, and when that happens, you won't be the one defining them anymore. Karen curled her lip but said nothing, turning away with slow, deliberate step. The white SUV revved loudly, its tires grinding hard against the pavement, leaving behind a shrill growl. I stood still, watching her go, a surge of anger and resolve rising in my chest. I didn't know what else she had planned, but one thing was certain. I would not let myself be broken by this blatant abuse of power. I I looked Karen straight in the eye, my voice sharp and deliberate, each word landing with weight. Not a single square foot of my home belongs to you. Silence fell for a moment. The few neighbors, still lingering, glanced at each other, quickly pretended to walk off. They didn't want to get involved, but their eyes had heard enough. Karen flipped her hair, a cold smile stretching across her lips, thinking that, you'll learn the HOA rules soon enough. She spat the words out like a curse, bitter enough to serve as a warning to anyone within earshot. The way she emphasized learn and HOA rules told me everything. She had no intention of stopping with the garage. This was only the opening shot. I let her leave, the white SUV turning the corner and disappearing. But in that moment, I saw the game begin. A woman who used to control and manipulate had just chosen her next target. Karen didn't need to say much. She only had to plant seeds of fear to keep everyone else quiet. That evening, I sat in the living room and skimmed through an email from the HOA. The terms were vague, tangled, almost intentionally confusing, written as if to make sure no one dared to challenge. Unused garages may be repurposed to serve the community's interest. The sentence stood out clearly, and I knew it was the shield Karen used to justify her overreach. No legal foundation, just a set of self-made rules. But in her mind, it was enough to turn nonsense into regulation. I remembered how the neighbors had avoided eye contact. She raised her voice at my door. Their silence wasn't consent. It was the silence of people who had been intimidated for too long. Karen didn't rule this place fairness, but with fear. And I knew if I bowed my head now, I'd never be able to lift it again. I opened my notebook and wrote a few lines. A vow to myself: my garage doesn't belong to the HOA. It doesn't belong to Karen. Anyone who tries to take it, I will fight back. The words were simple, but every stroke of ink felt like crossing a threshold. This wasn't just about a parking space anymore. It was about protecting my dignity, about giving my daughter a father she could look up. The next morning, as I took Amara to school, Karen stood once again on her porch. She looked straight at me. No words, just that tempestuous smile. It was enough to tell me she was already planning her next move. I met her gaze with calm resolve, silently letting her know I wasn't afraid. Inside, I understood. This confrontation would not be short-lived. Karen believed she held the HOA, false weight of manipulated rules, and the power of long-standing obedience. But I had patience, preparation, and an unshakable resolve not to let my daughter grow up under the shadow of a... I stepped into the car, the engine roaring to life. In the rearview mirror, I could still see Karen standing there, her eyes narrowed, watching my every move. She believed I would eventually learn the HOA rules the way she intended. But right then, I told myself, if there is any rule I will learn, it will be the rule of fairness, not the filthy power Karen is trying to build. I drove off, my chest heavy, but my resolve unshaken. The game had just begun, and I knew I wasn't backing down. The HOA meeting room was packed that evening, every resident seated as if attendance were mandatory. At the head of the table, Karen Lattimore was already in place, one hand resting on a thick stack of documents, a faint smile on her face as if the entire meeting existed solely for her to showcase. When the room fell silent, her voice rang out, sharp, almost shrill, clearly aimed at piercing through to me. If a garage is left empty for 30 days, it is considered unused and subject to HOA management. A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. I wasn't surprised, knowing Karen would use this moment to assert her authority. I sat upright and answered immediately, my voice firm, leaving no room for her to twist further. That's trespassing on private property. There is no legal statute that permits her to do this. The room went dead quiet, not because they were waiting for logic, but because everyone was holding their breath. In this neighborhood, few dared speak against Karen openly. An older man near the exit in his about to leave, then stayed, as if curious to see how far this would go. Karen looked at me, her smile no longer subtle, curled into something openly condescending. You haven't been here long. You're probably not used to how we operate. She put deliberate stress on the word we, a clear effort to set me apart from the rest. These rules were established long before you arrived, and I'm the one responsible for making sure they're followed. If everyone acted on personal whims, community order would fall apart. I tapped my fingers on the table, each dry knock cutting through her words. Community order doesn't come from one person deciding they make the rule. What you're doing isn't about protecting standards, it's about taking what isn't yours. A few eyes darted in my direction, then quickly dropped. They had heard every word, but not one person nodded or spoke in agreement. Karen leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her voice steady. You can call it whatever you like, but most residents here understand that the common good outweighs individual pride. Her gaze swept across those seated nearby, searching for support. support. A few reluctant nods followed, their hesitance obvious. Everyone knew they nodded out of fear, not belief. I exhaled slowly, leaning forward. The common good doesn't include you using HOA authority to park in someone else's garage. And if you need proof, I have all the documentation to show that garage rights belong solely to the homeowner. The law doesn't permit the HOA to cross into private property lines. I paused, eyes locked on Karen. Unless you believe you stand above the law. The room tightened like a drawn string. Karen curled her lip, then let out a short laugh. The law? Around here, I define the law. Few weak chuckles followed, but no one laughed aloud. I stayed still, letting her believe she had claimed the moment. But inside, I already knew. Karen had revealed her true nature. Not the mask of community leadership, but the arrogance of someone who sees herself as the law. I closed my folder and stood up slowly. If you believe your rules can stand above the law, just wait. I'll show this entire neighborhood the difference. I didn't shout, didn't slam the table, but the weight of my words made the room tremble. As I walked out, several eyes followed, some filled with fear, others with hope. I knew I had officially stepped into battle with Karen Lattimore, and there was no turning. Karen curled her lip, her eyes gleaming with triumph, her voice hissing through clenched teeth. Around here, I am the law. Those seated at the meeting table lowered their heads. Some pressed their lips together. Others tapped fingers against the surface to let it pass. Her words echoed through the narrow room, bouncing off the walls. They had already been carved there, unchallenged. I sat still, my face blank, though my heart pounded with each beat. Slowly, I placed my phone into my palm and pressed the record button. I said nothing more, letting Karen continue her monologue, because I knew the more evidence I had, the easier it would be to expose her abuse of power. The meeting dragged on, filled with language that sounded more like doctrine than discussion. Karen didn't lead a conversation. She dictated. She called the HOA the community shield, claiming that every property in the neighborhood needed to be centrally managed to preserve standards. The residents remained silent, seemingly accustomed to her sweetened threat. One young woman cautiously raised her hand, about to suggest that garages private property. Karen gave her a cold glance, and the woman quickly pulled back her word. I watched it unfold, saw the quiet helplessness spreading through the room. An older man gave a short cough, as if trying to break the tension, but eventually shook his head and gave up. Everyone there knew Karen had manipulated the HOA for too long, and anyone who dared to stand up would be pushed down without mercy. I closed my notebook and stared at Karen without blinking. She caught my gaze and froze for just a split second, then carried on, speaking boldly about collective responsibility. I didn't need to argue with her, not now. Arguing with someone who believes they are the law only gives them more stage time. What I needed was for her to expose her own arrogance, and now I had the recording to prove it. When the meeting ended, people stood up and left in small, quiet groups. A few glanced at me, then quickly looked away, as if afraid Karen might see. She calmly gathered her papers, walked past me, tilted her head, and gave a tight smile. "You'll learn how to live here. Everyone does." I stayed silent, letting her think I had surrendered. But inside, a fire was roaring. The phrase, "Around here, I am the law," would not go down easily. It would become evidence. And when the time came, that very line would back Karen into a corner she couldn't escape. I stepped out of the meeting room, the evening wind brushing against my face, but what I felt wasn't exhaustion. On the contrary, it was clarity. Karen had just exposed exactly how she ran the HOA, not through legal process, but through authoritarian control. What she called standard was nothing more than a disguise for greed and discrimination. I gripped the phone in my jacket pocket, where the full recording was stored. It was the most valuable confession, raw and unedited. One day, this entire community would hear Karen's own voice, the shameless declaration that she was the law. And when that day came, the wall of silence around her would collapse. If it were you, how would you respond to an HOA that declared, "An empty garage belongs to the community"? That night, as I stepped out into the yard to check the front door, a beam of flashlight swept across my face, making me freeze. A man in an HOA security uniform was circling my house, notebook in hand, occasionally stopping to snap photos of the garage before scribbling down a few notes. I walked up to him and asked what was going on. He responded bluntly, "Routine inspection. An empty garage is considered a violation." Then he turned and walked away without so much as a glance back. I stood still, fists clenched. I didn't need to ask who was behind this. Karen was no longer hiding the fact that I was her target. She wanted to twist even my smallest actions into evidence of wrongdoing, to cast me as the violator in the eyes of the community. When I got back to the living room, my phone buzzed nonstop. In the neighborhood group chat, Karen had posted a message along with several photos of my garage captioned, "An empty garage is wasteful and lowers our shared property value. He just moved in and already doesn't respect the standard." A stream of emoji reactions followed. Some liked it, others stayed silent, but what bothered me most were the comments echoing her message. "Yeah, It really does look neglected. Makes the whole place feel off. I read every line, feeling like the entire neighborhood was being led by Karen's narrative. She wasn't just targeting me. She was planting an image in everyone's mind that I was lazy, uncooperative, out of sync with the community. In a calculated way, she was isolating me with public opinion, turning nonsense into consensus using the power of her HOA title. I didn't respond right away. I knew that reacting out of anger would only give Karen more room to escalate. Instead, I saved every message, every image she posted publicly. I needed evidence, and she was handing it to me without realizing it. Amara came down the stairs, holding her work. She sat beside me and glanced at the phone screen, her face shadowed by worry. "Dad, why are people saying our garage is lowering the value? Our house looks fine." I put my arm around her, my voice low. "Some people use words to bring others down because they're afraid of the truth. Our garage isn't the problem. Their greed and ego are." Amara nodded softly, but I could still see unease in her eyes. I knew Karen wasn't just playing a power game with me. She was planting fear in my daughter's mind, fear of being labeled as different. That only strengthened my resolve. I had to stop her. That night, I returned to my desk, opened the printed HOA documents and property laws, and began cross-checking line by line. I marked every loophole, every vague phrase. The more I read, the clearer it became how Karen had exploited ambiguity to inflate her authority. A garage is private property, the law stated it plainly, but she twisted it into community space through manipulative language. The wind slammed against the window, and I looked. Flashlight beam passed over the walk. The HOA security officer was still like a predator patiently stalking its prey. Dark. I pressed my lips together and followed his footsteps with my eyes until his shadow finally disappeared. I knew I was being watched. Every action opened to being twisted into a violation. But instead of making me afraid, it only hardened my resolve. Karen thought I would fold under a few criticisms and some sneaky photos. She had underestimated me completely. This was only the opening act, and I would make her pay using the very game she started. I looked at Karen's message in the neighborhood chat paired with photos of my garage, and I saw her playbook clearly. This wasn't about protecting shared property values. It was psychological warfare. She wanted to plant an image of me as irresponsible in every neighbor's mind so that when I walked outside, suspicious glances would make me feel like I didn't belong. I thought to myself, she wants to isolate me with public opinion, but I'm going to flip the board. Right then, I opened my contacts and selected a name I hadn't reached out to in years, Marcus Hale, the lawyer who once advised me during a property dispute long ago. He had since left his law firm and was now teaching at a university, but no one knew more about HOAs and the way they skirt the edges of legality than he did. I sent a short message. "I need help. The HOA is overstepping." Less than an hour later, Marcus called. His voice was low and steady, carried that sharpness I remembered well. "Tell me everything from the beginning." I gave him a concise rundown, from Karen occupying the garage to her smear campaign in the chat. On the other end, he was silent, save for the sound of keys tapping and steady breathing. Finally, he said, "I know exactly that you need to keep every piece of evidence, photos, messages, and, if possible, record any statements she makes claiming HOA authority beyond its legal limit. That will be your weapon." I leaned back in my chair, the phone screen glowing in the dark. Just hearing Marcus say that gave me some relief. I wasn't alone, and more importantly, I had someone with legal insight behind me. Karen might have the HOA. She might have the neighborhood's fear as her shield. But I had the law, and I had the will to fight. Marcus added, "Don't react directly out of anger. People like her are trained to twist that into wrongdoing. Let them reveal themselves, and you keep collecting. Once you have enough, I'll show you how to take it straight to the city board. Trust, an HOA president who calls herself the law doesn't survive long." I nodded, though he couldn't see it. After the call, I reopened the neighborhood chat. Karen was still going at it, dressing up her disdain as concern for the community. I didn't respond. I just saved each post. Some added nodding emojis, others tossed in mocking comments, but between them I noticed a few silent replies that were quickly deleted, as if someone had tried to push back but couldn't bear to attach their name. That told me one thing: not everyone supported Karen. They just hadn't found the reason or the courage to speak up yet. I set the phone down and stepped out onto the porch. The night breeze was cool against my face, but my mind burned with calculation. This was no longer about the garage. This was a battle of principle, and I had no intention of letting Karen win. She was used to imposing, used to others bowing their heads, but this time, her opponent had no plans to back down. I went back inside, grabbed a new notebook, and began recording every event, every date, every word Karen had spoken. Each page would be a brick, and when the time came, I would build a wall of evidence. Part of me was still angry, but another part had settled into something calm, almost cold. Karen might think I was alone, but I held in my hands what she could never control, the truth and the law. I wrote to the final line, set the pen down, and stared out at the dim silhouette of the garage. That empty space was no longer a park. It had become a symbol of the violation I was going to answer with justice, and I swore the day would come when Karen Lattimore would bow her head and admit it in front of this entire neighborhood. I came home one afternoon and immediately noticed the garage door slightly open. As I walked quickly toward it, I saw Karen Lattimore crouched inside, her hand resting on the breaker box as if she were preparing to inspect every inch. Her audacity had crossed every imaginable line. I shouted, my voice echoing down the walkway, "This is my house. You've just committed trespassing." My words startled Karen, but she quickly regained her composure. She turned around, chin lifted high, her eyes flashing with disdain. "Don't throw around dramatic terms," Karen replied with a mocking tone. "I'm the HOA president. I have the right to inspect when there are signs of a violation. An unused garage is a serious concern, and I'm fulfilling my responsibility." I stepped inside, blocking the doorway, eyes fixed on her. "You have no authority to set foot in here. The law is clear. Garages are private property. You just crossed a line, and you will be held accountable." Karen folded her arms, a cold smile spreading across her lips. "You think you can scare me with a few legal references? People here know how I maintain standards. They'll believe me, not you. You're new, you're different, and now you're challenging the HOA. Do you really think you have a chance?" Every word hit like a slap, prejudice unfiltered. I noticed a few neighbors walking by on the street had stopped, glancing toward the garage. Karen was putting on a show, making sure she had an audience. I lowered my voice, but each word was sharp. "You talk a lot about standard, but the truth is, you're just using the HOA to feed your ego. You walk into my house and call it responsibility? This is trespassing and I have the evidence." Karen let out a short laugh, as if I had said something ridiculous. "Say whatever you want. Tomorrow you'll find a violation notice in your mailbox, and when the residents read it, they'll know I'm protecting the common interest." She emphasized the word common interest, as if to shut down the conversation. I stepped closer, closing the space between us to just inches. "You can invent as many justifications as you want, but remember, I'm not the kind of person who stays silent. If you keep crossing boundaries, you'll be the one explaining yourself to this entire community, not me." The tension was so heavy that even a few people standing outside the gate took a step back. Karen looked at me, flicker of unease in her eyes, but then forced a smirk, trying to appear unshaken. "You'll understand soon enough. This isn't a fight you can win." Tilted my head slightly and answered firmly, "On the contrary, it's you who doesn't understand what you've just ignited." Karen turned and walked, her heels striking the cement forced confidence, trying to show she was still in control, but I could see the cracks forming in her confidence. I watched her go, my hand tightening around the phone that held the meeting recording and every photo of evidence I needed. A fire rose in me, a mix of anger and resolve. Karen might believe she was the law, but I knew exactly where the real law stood. And from the moment she stepped into my garage uninvited, all forms of compromise were over. This was no longer a neighborhood dispute. It was an open war, and I was ready for it. Karen stood with her hands on her hips, her eyes fixed on me, and her voice burst out with arrogant force. "Do you think the police will listen to a black man who just moved in? Or to the HOA I represent?" The words dropped like stone, carrying both threat and the barefaced contempt she had been hiding behind her mask of protecting the community. I heard murmurs from the walkway. A few neighbors had stopped, but none dared step in. I took a deep breath, locking eyes with Karen. "You'll soon find out who I am." My voice wasn't loud, but every word landed like a blade. She flinched for half a second, then gave a short, mocking laugh, shaken, though she tried to play it off. I could see the cracks forming in her smugness, no matter how tightly she clung to it. Karen stepped forward, trying to look unfazed. "You can threaten all you want, but around here, my word is law. You're an outsider. You'll never win." Her tone wavered, barely, but it did. I leaned in slightly, just enough for her to hear every syllable. "Every time you speak, you hand me more proof of your abuse and prejudice. Keep going. You're digging the grave of your HOA chair one quote at a time." Karen stiffened, then turned away, her steps heavier than before. I stood there for a moment longer, fully aware of the eyes on me from nearby homes. Some watched with silent empathy, others stared at the ground, pretending they hadn't seen. Either way, I knew I had just driven a crack through the wall of power Karen had. She was no longer the unquestioned queen, not in every eye. Doubt had been planted. That night, I wrote down every detail of the confrontation in my note, every word Karen had said, every expression she wore. I didn't want any of it fade, because it was all part of the file I was quietly unsightly building. In my mind, I could hear Marcus Hale, my lawyer friend, let them reveal themselves. Karen had done exactly that, and I just needed to stay patient. When I stepped onto the balcony and felt the night air on my face, I thought of Amara. She hadn't witnessed what just happened, and for that, I was grateful. I didn't want her to see the naked humiliation her father had just endured. That only strengthened my resolve. I would show her that her father didn't fold, that power could be abused, but justice could still be reclaimed. In the darkness, the garage sat silently, an unmoving witness to everything that had taken place. I clenched my Karen might have thought her threat, laced with my race, would make me back down. But she was wrong. That sentence became the line in the sand, turning this into a battle I was ready to fight to the end. As I closed the door behind me, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Karen Lattimore might believe the HOA was an untouchable shield, but she had picked the wrong opponent. And step by step, I would show her exactly who I was. I opened my computer and pulled up the photos of Karen opening my garage door and inspecting the inside without permission. With just a few clicks, they were posted on the online forum for Maple Grove Estates residents. I didn't add any lengthy explanation, just a simple note. This is unauthorized trespassing. My garage does not belong to the HOA. Within an hour, the comments poured in. One resident wrote, "No one has the right to step into someone else's home, no matter what the title is." Another added, "This is clearly an abuse of power. The HOA can't treat private property like its backyard." I read every word, feeling the wave of outrage beginning to grow. Karen didn't stay silent. That very afternoon, she posted a reply nearly a full page long, opening with an accusation that I was a non-compliant resident resisting community standards. She cited selective excerpts from the HOA document, cutting and twisting them to serve her narrative. Her post ended with a tone of smug warning. "If everyone keeps their garage unused like this, Maple Grove Estates will lose all its value." The divide in reactions became clear. A few of Karen's close allies chimed in, saying, "Upholding standards is everyone's responsibility." But the majority of residents left sharp questions. How does an empty garage of property value? Why does the HOA president have the right to open someone else's door? The more people spoke up, the more aggressively Karen responded, replying to each comment with a hostile tone, turning the forum into a stage for her power play. I didn't interfere, just watched quietly. Marcus Hale messaged me privately, "Don't jump in. Let her show who she really is. The more people see how unreasonable she is, the better for you." He was right. Within 2 days, the discussion had drawn nearly every resident into the forum. Even those who had stayed silent before began to participate, not to defend me, but because they realized that if Karen could walk into my garage today, she could walk into theirs tomorrow. Some shared stories of being fined by Karen for letting a guest's car stay overnight. Others said they received violation notices over fence paint that was not up to standard. My case became the breaking point, unleashing a flood of long-held frustration. The forum, once filled with lawn care updates and weekend event photos, had become a place to openly question the authority of the HOA. Karen grew increasingly unhinged. One of her newest posts read, "Those who can't adapt to our standards should find somewhere else to live." The words dripped discrimination, and everyone knew exactly who she was targeting. But that only pushed more people to the other side. One resident pushed back. "Standards mean respecting privacy, not letting one person do whatever she wants in the name of the community." I read every word, feeling something unfamiliar rise inside me. It was no longer just me against Karen. The community was waking up. I saved every thread, every word she wrote, because I knew it would all become solid evidence. That night, I sat in front of the glowing screen, watching as new comments continued to roll in. For the first time since moving in, I didn't feel alone. Karen still held power, but that power was starting to shake. And I knew from this moment forward, she had lost her most dangerous weapon, the silent compliance of the residents of Maple Grove Estate. Karen didn't wait long to strike back. She posted a long message, opening with the familiar claim, "He's making this up. The garage is community property." Her words read like a command, laced with arrogance, deliberately emphasizing the HOA's authority like it was some kind of charm she could hide behind. I read every line, and I could picture her face as she typed, eyes lit up, believing she still had control. But what Karen didn't anticipate was the response followed. Within hours, the forum was flooded with comments. One resident wrote, "The garage is part of the house. How can it be community property?" Another added, "I've lived here over 10 years and never heard of such a rule. That's the homeowner's business." For the first time, voices that had stayed quiet began to speak up openly. Karen tried to hold her ground, replying flying nonstop, bending the rules to fit her interpretation. She repeated the phrase, shared standards, as if saying it enough times would make it true. Every word she posted brought another resident's challenge. A middle-aged woman asked bluntly, "If his garage belongs to the community, does that mean my living room is open to the public too?" That question was met with a wave of light, and Karen went silent for several hours. I sat watching the screen, each line appearing like the first crack in the wall of power Karen had built for so long. I didn't have to say a word. Residents themselves had started to push back, and that was what Karen feared most, the silence being broken. That evening, Marcus Hale messaged me, "Let them argue. Don't respond yet. They need to see the truth for themselves, not through your defense, but through her action." I followed his advice. I didn't post a single comment, only saved every word of the unfolding debate. By the next morning, the situation had grown even more. Karen posted a new mess, her tone sharper than ever. "If everyone resists like this, the neighborhood will lose all order. Those who can't adapt should consider moving out." It was clear she was losing control. Her message no longer sounded like a HOA president. It was a threat, and the residents weren't swallowing it any. One man replied immediately, "We live here. We pay our dues. No one has the right to tell us to leave because we don't agree with you." The backlash spread quickly. Residents began bringing up past instances where Karen had overstepped, fining people for the wrong fence color, banning kids from playing in common areas for being too loud. My story had become the tipping point, and years of buried frustration came rushing to the surface. One by one, these individual accounts formed a complete picture. Karen had ruled Maple Grove Estates through intimidation and control. I read everything, and a feeling I couldn't quite describe began to rise inside me. This was no longer just my fight. It had become the fight of an entire community. Karen could keep shouting that the garage was community property, but she couldn't stop the truth that was now plain for everyone to see. Her arrogance had become the very weapon that destroyed the credibility she once used to keep the residents in check. When I shut down the computer, I knew one thing for certain. Karen had just lost her greatest advantage. She was no longer the only voice being heard in this neighborhood, and once silence is broken, cannot be restored. This was the moment I needed to prepare for the next step, because from now on, Karen Lattimore was no longer the undisputed manipulator in the eyes of everyone else. That afternoon, I was preparing to leave for a short business. Just as I rolled my suitcase to the gate, I saw Karen's familiar white SUV turn sharply into my garage, her tires grinding hard against the concrete in a clearly deliberate move. She rolled down her window, smirked, and said with open defiance, "Try locking it. I'll sue you for property damage." I stood still for a few seconds, looking straight into her eyes. That mocking smile felt like a slap, but I didn't let emotion cloud my focus. My voice came out cold as steel. "You just gave me the reason I needed." Karen's face flickered, but she forced another crooked smile, pretending not to care. I pulled my suitcase back inside, leaving the SUV arrogantly parked in the garage. In my mind, everything was crystal clear. This was no longer about an empty garage or community standard. This was blatant provocation, a declaration that she could do whatever she pleased and no one would stop her. Karen believed the power of the HOA would shield her, that my skin color would keep the police from listening. This time, she had crossed the line. I pulled out my phone and sent a short message to Marcus Hale. "Game on." His reply was just one word: ready. That word alone gave me even more certainty. I knew I wasn't alone. When I returned to the garage, Karen was still in her car, her stare full of challenge. I didn't say a word. I just pressed the remote, watching the door begin to close slowly. Karen jumped, quickly reaching for her car door, but I stopped the door with a button press, leaving a narrow gap. I wanted her to understand I could shut it completely at any moment, and that control was in my hand. "You really going to do it?" she shouted, her voice furious but tinged with panic. I stepped forward, eyes locked on hers. "Go ahead and treat my garage like it's your front porch one more time. You'll find out what happened." She laughed loudly, but the sound was strained, the confidence gone. "You think a few photos and some words online are going to save you? I have the full HOA board behind me. I'll make you sell your house and crawl out of here." I just nodded slightly, refusing to argue. "You just buried yourself." Then I pressed the button. The garage door closed, cutting off her stare. The darkness swallowed the SUV, and the grinding of her tires against the concrete was the last threat she could. As the door shut, I felt something unfamiliar. No anger, just total clarity. I knew the moment had come. Karen had gone too far, and now I had every reason to act. From that second on, the plan forming in my mind was no longer an idea. It was a decision. That night, I sat at my desk and mapped it all out. I wouldn't rush. I wouldn't strike head on. I would let Karen walk herself off the ledge. Every action, every threat would become evidence against her. And when the time was right, the final blow would come. and the whole community would be there to see it. Karen thought her threat would scare me, but in truth, the words, "Try locking it, I'll sue you," had unlocked an opportunity I would never waste. And I swore, the next time that garage door comes down, it will never rise again on Karen Lattimore's terms. That very night, I opened my laptop and searched for a heavy-duty steel lock system and a remote control unit for the garage. I chose the most expensive option, not to show off, but because I needed to be absolutely sure that Karen wouldn't be able to send a handyman or an HOA security officer to break it. When the order was confirmed, I felt as if I had laid the first brick in a wall of protection, not just for the garage, but for my dignity. As I hit confirm purchase, a strange calm settled inside me. I knew I had made a definitive move. The hesitation, the mental tug of war over whether to tolerate or retaliate, was over. All that remained was resolve. It's time to strike back. I repeated that phrase again and again, as if sealing shut the last door of doubt. The next day, I saw Karen on the lawn near my house. She was chatting with a few residents, her gaze sharp the moment it met mine. That thin smile appeared on her lip, as if to remind me she still believed she held the upper hand in this fight. I returned her stare with quiet calm, saying nothing, letting her believe my silence was fear. But in my mind, every step was already planned. When the installers arrived with the lock system and remote, I stood by, supervising the setup. The garage door slammed down, the metal clamped shut with a solid, definitive sound. It was the sound of a promise. From that moment on, the garage was no longer just a place to park. It was my fortress. Karen could call it community property all she wanted, but she would have to live with the reality that steel walls don't follow her command. I pressed the remote. The door lowered, the steel locks engaged. A wave of satisfaction moved through me. I imagined the look on Karen's face when she realized she could no longer step inside. She was used to her words being treated like command, but this time she was up against a door that would refuse, cold, silent, and absolute. That night, I called Marcus Hale and updated him on my preparation. He laughed through the phone. Good. Don't let her think you're only defending. If needed, show her you can strike back. And when you do, you go all the way. His advice matched exactly what I had already planned. As night fell, I sat in the living room, yellow light casting shadows across the wooden table. I remembered every word Karen had said. I remembered her mocking laugh when she asked, "You think the police will believe you?" And I remembered the look in Amara's eyes when she asked why our garage was being called public property. All of it pushed me further forward. There was no space left for compromise. I looked outside and saw the lights still on in Karen's house, her silhouette passing behind the window. Maybe she still believed everything in Maple Grove Estates was in her control, but I knew something she didn't. The moment that lock was installed, the board had shifted. Karen Lattimore had no idea that her challenge, "Try locking it," had become the key that handed me full control, and I was going to use it to launch a game she would never see coming. That morning, I went about my preparations calmly, as if it were just another ordinary day. I knew Karen's routine, knew she usually passed by my house at a predictable hour, and all I needed to do was create the opportunity. I opened the garage, deliberately leaving the door half raised, then stepped out into the yard as if unaware. Just as I expect, Karen's familiar white SUV slowly rolled up and she drove straight inside with a smug expression, as if she had just claimed victory on my own territory. I stood in the corner of the yard, my hand quietly gripping the remote. With a single press, the garage door began its descent. The mechanical hum filled the air, heavy and deliberate, ending with a cold, final. Karen immediately panicked, flinging open her door and screaming, "Open it! My car is stuck!" Her shrill voice echoed down the street, drawing startled glances from a few neighbors. I walked forward, my gaze steady. "This is my garage. You once said it belonged to the community, so now the community can witness you explaining why your personal vehicle is parked inside public property." Karen's face flushed red as she slammed her hands against the steel door, but it was pointless. The metal lock groaned under her fist, unyielding as my resolve. She screamed again, her voice hoarse with fury. You'll be sued." I allowed myself a faint smile and replied coolly, "I'm leaving for a 10-day vacation. Enjoy the dark." With that, I rolled my case toward the waiting taxi. Amara sat beside me, eyes wide, not yet ready to ask questions, but I simply placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "This is how you people respect." I glanced back once more and saw Karen still standing there, yelling at the sealed garage. She was used to issuing command, used to seeing others bow their head, but not this time. This time, she was trapped inside the very arrogance she had wielded so freely. Neighbors began to gather, some whispering, others smirking. An elderly man shook his head and muttered to the person next to him, "Serves her right," thought she could do whatever she wanted. Those murmurs were the first clear signs that the balance had. Karen was no longer the figure who silenced the neighborhood with her presence. She had become a public spectacle. On the way to the airport, I opened my phone and saw a flood of messages in the community group. Many were celebratory. Bet the HOA president finally knows whose garage that is. Someone even shared a photo of Karen pounding on the door, captioned, "Who's the law now?" Quietly saved every message, knowing these pieces of evidence would further expose the truth. Karen wasn't a guardian of community standards. She was an abuser of power, spiraling into defeat. As the taxi pulled away from Maple Grove Estates, I closed my eyes for a brief moment and let the rare peace settle in. I didn't feel like I had ended the war, only entered a new phase. But the most important thing was clear. Karen Lattimore could not manipulate me through fear or threat. This retaliation wasn't about personal satisfaction alone. It was a wake-up call to the entire community. And as I left for my 10-day trip, I knew one thing with certainty. Behind me, Karen would be left face a humiliation she never saw coming. I stood in front of the garage door, listening to Karen's screams behind the freshly sealed steel. She pounded her fists wildly, the sound echoing with each blow, but all it did was expose her desperation. I stared into her eyes through the narrow gap, calmly delivering each word. My garage, my rules. You said it belonged to the community, so now it belongs to the dark. Karen's face turned crimson, veins bulging at her temple. She shouted, her voice hoarse with rage, while I remained silent, lifting my suitcase and stepping away. The taxi was already waiting by the gate. I opened the door, looked back one last time, and said flatly, "I'm going away for 10 days. Enjoy." The driver glanced at me in the mirror, briefly puzzled by the sight of the woman still banging on the garage door, her screams echoing down the street. I just shrugged and signaled him to drive. The taxi pulled away slowly, leaving behind the image of Karen trapped in the very game she had orchestrated. Maple Grove Estates had never witnessed anything like it. Neighbors peeked out from behind curtains, some even snapping photos. They whispered to each other, half shocked, half amused. For years, Karen had been the shadow of power they hesitated to confront, but now, that image shattered right before their eyes. I leaned back in the seat, feeling as though a heavy stone had finally lifted from my chest. Karen had spent days trying to impose her will, bending every word to fit her version of the truth. But in this single moment, I had flipped the entire board. No shouting, no HOA meetings, just one move using the very weapon she brought to the fight, her own arrogance. My phone buzzed with constant notifications. The community forum had exploded. Someone had posted a photo of Karen locked outside the garage with the caption, "The one who said it belonged to everyone now stuck in her own dark." Hundreds of comments followed, many mocking, many gleeful. One resident wrote, "Serves her right. She's been doing whatever she wants for years. Now she gets a taste." Another replied, "I got fined once for a guest car parked overnight. This feels like just..." I read every line, faint smile forming. This wasn't just a personal story anymore. It was the unraveling of blind faith in the HOA. Karen still believed she could control everything with her authority, but the residents were beginning to see clearly. Real law lives in fairness, not in one person's word. I rested against the seat, watching the streetlights slide past the taxi window in streaks of gold. Amara sat quietly beside me, then asked softly, "Dad, will she get out?" I smiled and placed a hand on her shoulder. "She'll have to face what she's done. That's what justice looks like." Deep down, I knew these next 10 days wouldn't just be a vacation. They would be the time Karen slowly absorbed the humiliation, the time the community began to see her for who she truly was, and the time the story spread so far that no one would dare stand beside her again. This strike wasn't just about trapping a car. It was about locking away the false authority she had built over the years. Every second the garage remained closed would echo louder than any argument. Karen had always relied on silence, on fear, on the assumption that people would look away. But now, she was the one exposed, the one under scrutiny. Her SUV wasn't just stuck in a garage. It had become a symbol of arrogance undone. The street where she once walked with impunity had turned into a stage, and the audience wasn't applauding her anymore. Instead, they whispered, took photos, shared laughs behind curtains. Karen's greatest fear was never being challenged. It was losing control. And now, for the first time, she couldn't command the narrative. As I rode farther from Maple Grove Estates, I felt the distance not just in miles, but in clarity. I wasn't acting out of vengeance. I was holding up a mirror, letting her see the reflection she had forced on others. If that image brought shame, it wasn't because of what I'd done. It was because of what she had become. This wasn't the end of anything. It was only the beginning of accountability. And for Karen, it meant one thing. No more hiding behind the title of HOA president. From now on, every step she took would echo with the question she never wanted asked. What if the garage was never hers to begin with? The very next morning, just as I arrived at my hotel in Florida, my phone lit up with notification. Neighbors had recorded the entire scene of Karen yanking at the garage door, screaming in the middle of the night, faced it in rage. The clip was first posted in the residents group, then spread to Facebook, and from there, across housing rights forum. In the video, the streetlights cast a harsh glow on Karen struggling with the garage handle, shouting threats that echoed through the neighborhood. A few neighbors stood at a distance, their laughter mingled with whispers. After all these years of bullying others, she's finally getting a taste of her own medicine. Within hours, the clip had drawn thousands of comments. Lines popped up nonstop. Serves her right. Karma. So who's keeping the standards now? Sitting on my hotel balcony, I laughed as the internet carried the story far beyond what I had expected. One account commented, "Karen deserves a spot on the worst HOA presidents in America list." Someone else made a meme, photoshopping her onto a horror movie poster with the title, "The Garage Screamer." I kept scrolling, sipping my coffee as I watched a new wave of reckoning gather momentum. What surprised me most was how even those who had remained silent so long finally began to speak up. One neighbor wrote, "Last year, I was fined $200 just for hanging Christmas lights a week early. Now I realize it wasn't about the rules. It was about her humiliating people." That single post drew in dozens more, all sharing similar experiences. The iron grip Karen had wrapped around the community finally being undone, strand by strand. Karen, of course, didn't stay quiet. In another video, she stood in front of the HOA meeting hall, disheveled, but still shouting, "This is slander! The garage belongs to the community. I had every right to enter," but no one was listening anymore. People spliced her outburst with the footage of her trapped in the garage, turning it into a viral joke. Every attempt she made to defend herself only fueled the mockery. I knew this was just day one, and it was far from over. What I began by locking a garage had turned into a wildfire, exposing a truth everyone knew but had been too afraid to speak aloud. I didn't have to shout or persuade. One small act had unleashed a tidal wave. Amara ran out to the balcony, giggling as she watched a remix video of Karen overlaid with cartoon music. She asked, "Dad, is everyone online on our side now?" I nodded, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. "Not just on our side. They're taking justice into their own hands." That first day of the going viral proved one thing clearly. Karen was no longer the one laying down the law. She had become a public spectacle, the symbol of unchecked power finally dragged into the light. And I knew this was just the beginning of the many days ahead in which she would be forced to live under the weight of public. Karen began to panic when she saw her name being dragged across forum. My phone buzzed nonstop with messages from her, some short, some long. "Open the door. My car's been stuck for days. I'll sue you for unlawfully detaining property." Then shifting to, "We can negotiate. I'll let the past go." Every word revealed how far she had fallen from her usual haughty posture. But I calmly turned off my phone, letting the screen fade into silence. I knew clearly that her desperation was only beginning, and that beginning was exactly what I'd been waiting for. While Karen scrambled to save herself, the story had already grown far beyond Maple Grove Estates. Local news sites began reporting on the HOA woman trapped by her neighbor's garage. The comments were blazing with outrage, repeating one word over and over: karma. Social media users dissected property law, quoted ownership rights, and even real attorneys weighed in, confirming that the HOA had no legal claim to someone's private garage. Every arrow pointed at Karen. One evening in my hotel room, I came across a featured article, "When an HOA becomes a tool for control instead of protection." The author listed example after example, from Karen fining residents for hanging flags, forcing the elderly to remove flower pots, to bullying children for riding bikes in the common area. Each sentence stripped away the mask she had hidden behind for years. I smiled to myself, thinking, maybe now people finally understand the garage was just the last straw. The incident turned into a phenomenon. On TikTok, people launched a garage challenge, reenacting being trapped in a garage while screaming like Karen. Each video drew hundreds of thousands of likes, turning her into a national joke. On Facebook, photos of Karen stuck with her car circulated wide, captioned, "When you think you are the law, but the law locks you in a garage." The name Karen Lattimore was no longer a symbol of authority. It had become a punchline. Still, what satisfied me most wasn't the mocking laughter, but the unity of once silent neighbors. Many began signing collective letters demanding a review of Karen's position on the board. Those who once feared her authority were now speaking up, empowered by public support. They were the most important part of this movement because they proved that once the truth is exposed, oppression has nowhere left to stand. Karen surely never imagined that one press of my remote trigger such a powerful chain reaction. What began as a personal retaliation had become a movement, pulling the whole community toward justice. As I shut off my phone and let her flail, I knew that for the first time in years, she was the one being pushed into isolation. And that, to me, was the most fitting sentence public opinion could deliver to someone who built their rule on the fear of others. On the morning of the day, I received a message from a friendly neighbor. Karen just showed up with a locksmith trying to break into your garage. I immediately opened the residents group live stream. The scene couldn't have been more ridiculous. Karen, in an overdone dress, face tense, lipstick smeared across her cheek, stood beside a locksmith fumbling with the steel lock. Neighbors surrounded them, phones raised to film, voices buzzing with commentary. An old man shouted, "This is private property, you have no right." A woman chimed in, "We saw the clip before. This garage isn't yours." Karen raised her voice, trembling but trying to sound authoritative. "I'm the HOA president. It's my responsibility to protect community standards. He wasn't using the garage, so I'm managing it for him." The moment those words left her mouth, the crowd erupted in mocking laughter. A young man pushed his camera closer and snapped, "Protecting standards or protecting your sick ego?" That question instantly became a viral quote across the forum. Amid the crowd, a resident called the local police. When 2 officers arrived, Karen switched tacks and burst into tears. She covered her face, mascara streaming down her cheeks, sobbing as she pointed to the garage. "He locked my car up 5 days. I'm the victim. I can't take it anymore." But then a woman's voice rang out from the crowd. "You're the victim, yet you hired someone to break into someone else's house?" The entire group voiced agreement, forcing Karen to back off. A clip of Karen sobbing, makeup smeared, clutching her purse to hide her face, quickly hit Facebook. Within an hour, thousands of shares poured in, each caption more biting than the last. "HOA queen collapsed. When mascara can't save your reputation." Or, "So this is the standard she was defending." This wasn't just a ripple. It was a public storm that swept away every shred of power Karen had spent years. I sat in my hotel room, opened my phone, and smirked. I didn't have to say a word. The community had done it all for me. The more Karen tried to justify herself, the more she looked like a fool. Each tear mixing with her melting makeup inspired no sympathy, only a deep sense of satisfaction that the person who once weaponized contempt had now fallen flat into it. That day, Maple Grove Estates seemed split in two. On one side stood Karen and a few loyalists, silent in shame. On the other hand, fired-up community is buzzing with plans to send the footage to major news outlets. For the first time, this neighborhood had found a shared voice, born from the wreckage of someone who once controlled them all. That night, I found myself thinking back to the words I uttered while closing the garage. My rule. Turns out, I didn't need a courtroom or one decisive action was enough to ignite a wild. Karen thought 5 days would wear me down, but those 5 days came her own night. And now, no matter how loud she screamed, the microphone of public opinion no longer belongs to her. The entire Maple Grove Estates community seemed to erupt that day. Within just hours of the locksmith incident, the internet had turned Karen into the epicenter of mockery. Photos of her smeared makeup face were edited into countless memes that spread like wildfire. One of the most widely shared images showed her clutching her handbag over her face with the cold caption below, "Community garage, community shame." No one saw her as a representative of standards anymore, but rather as the symbol of absurdity. In the residents group, laughter and comments poured in nonstop. One person added a plastic crown to Karen's head, dubbing her the Queen of Meltdown, and another spliced photo beside a trash bin with the caption, "HOA standard." What surprised me wasn't the humor, but the speed. Just a day ago, many were still hesitant, afraid of retaliation for speaking out against Karen. Now they were commenting openly, tagging each other, even calling for a vote to remove her from office. I sat in my hotel room, watching the non-stop stream of updates on my phone. Someone wrote, "We live in a neighborhood, not a monarchy. Who does she think she is to decide what happens to someone else's garage?" Another replied, "The HOA queen has become a joke. We need a community, not a tyrant." I could see a shared resolve forming, fear dissolving, replaced by a giddy sense of justice as her fake authority was torn to shreds. That night, the local press joined in. A digital news site ran the headline, "HOA president accused of breaking into resident's garage, neighbors capture it all." The article included the video of Karen screaming, mascara running, and within hours, it racked up tens of thousands of views. Larger outlets quickly caught on, adding commentary. This is one of the clearest examples of an HOA overstepping its bounds. What had once been a private neighborhood drama now became a hot topic across the city. Karen didn't stay quiet. She posted a long message in the group, trying to explain her actions as being for the good of the community. But immediately below, residents fired back. What community agreed to let you barge into my garage? Or, your interests, not ours. Don't drag us into it. Each comment was a hammer blow to the power facade she had built. Every justification only made her look more like someone desperately clinging to authority than a leader. One afternoon, I received a message from a neighbor who once avoided my gaze. He wrote, "Thank you. Without you, we would have kept our heads down." That short line meant more to me than any formal victory. I knew then that Karen's downfall wasn't just a personal defeat. It was a reckoning for an entire community that had been silent too long. The fifth day ended with roaring laughter in the group chat. People joked that Maple Grove no longer had an HOA queen, only an HOA clown. She, who once made everyone tread carefully, had become the nightly joke among neighbors. And I understood, once a community sees the truth behind the mask, no disguise can ever hide it again. Karen had dug her own pit, and the residents were more than happy to help fill it in. The question first appeared in the residents' group as a sarcastic jab, quickly ignited a firestorm. If an empty garage is community property, does that mean Karen's house is too? In just one line, the entire twisted logic Karen had built crumbled before everyone's eyes. Those who had stayed silent now began speaking openly, their words appearing on the screen like a barrage, stripping away the absurdity that had, until now, only lived in private thought. Karen tried to recover by deleting comments, restricting replies in the group, but the residents were no longer silent. They took screenshots, spread them outside the group, and shared them across major social media circles in the city. If she says an unused garage belongs to the community, then what about her empty living room? Does that belong to us too? One resident posted, heavy with sarcasm. The more comments like that appeared, the more ground Karen lost. In the past, Karen had always leaned on her HOA chair position to impose her will. Every word she spoke became unwritten law. But now, for the first time, people were using that very law to push back. In the eyes of the residents, Karen was no longer a keeper of order, but someone who twisted rules for personal gain. Conversations in parking lots and nearby cafes circled around the same topic. Karen had gone too far, and it was time for the community to confront it. The pressure grew by the day. A group of residents began drafting a petition calling for an emergency meeting, stating clearly, the HOA is no longer a tool for protecting the community, but one being exploited to serve a single person's ego. The petition was passed around quickly, and in less than 2 days, over half the households had signed it. People were blunt. If there's no meeting, we'll take it to the county court. Karen still tried to resist. She sent mass emails citing vague HOA bylaws, insisting the residents had misunderstood her intention, but everyone saw it for what it was, reflection. One person responded beneath her message, right or wrong, the video doesn't lie. You entered the garage, you exposed yourself. I watched everything unfold without saying a word. Everything I had done before, recordings, footage, evidence, was now paying off. I wasn't leading this revolt, the residents were. The very people who had once been afraid were now the fire. I realized that when trust is betrayed too many times, an uprising becomes inevitable. That evening, a flyer appeared across the community bulletin board. Emergency all-resident meeting. Agenda. Reassessment of HOA chair role. The white paper, bold black letters, seemed lifeless at a glance, but to those in Maple Grove, it read like a declaration of liberation. No one called Karen the HOA queen anymore. She was now the shadow about to be erased. I sat inside the house, staring at the piece of paper someone had quietly slipped under the door. My hand tightened, not out of anger, but because I sensed an opportunity had arrived. A chance to turn truth into evidence, outrage into justice, and a silenced community into one that finally stand upright. Karen had grown used to living in the illusion that her power was permanent, but I knew that with just one emergency meeting, the truth would turn her into the one on the losing end. And this time, I was no longer the lone person standing against Karen. The entire community had spoken up. Karen didn't sit quietly as pressure mounted. She turned to her old tactic, fabricating stories to cast herself as the victim. In a live stream with a small group of supporters, Karen claimed I was threatening the community, that I had used aggressive language that made residents feel unsafe. She even embellished her account, saying I once said I would teach a lesson to anyone who defied me. These fabrications spread fast, but this time they didn't stick the way they used to. What she didn't anticipate was that the evidence was everywhere. The video I posted, the audio recording from the HOA meeting, the images of Karen storming into my garage, they all told a very different story. People only had to place the facts side by side to see who was truly making the community feel unsafe. One resident commented directly under Karen's post, if he's the threat, why did she break into his garage? Videos don't lie. For the first time, Karen's accusations didn't make people back down. Instead, they became a joke. Memes spread. A picture of Karen shouting, captioned, "This is me when I find out out there's evidence against me." Someone more biting wrote, "The real threat to the community is the one who thinks other people's property is hers." And so, every smear Karen launched only served as another blade slicing into whatever tattered reputation she had left. I didn't bother defending myself. I knew silence was the most effective counterattack. The fewer words I spoke, the more residents focused on the facts, on the images that couldn't be denied. Karen, in her panic and smear campaign, had backed herself into a corner. The louder she shouted about being threatened, the more clearly she revealed her fear. In passing conversations, I heard residents saying, "If he really was threatening, why haven't we ever seen it?" Or, "Karen's inventing a villain to cover the truth, but she picked the wrong time." These whispers, when echoed enough, became a verdict harsher than any court ruling. It was the loss of trust, something no position or authority could ever buy back. The next day, I opened my phone to find my inbox full. Some neighbors had sent messages of support, saying they had signed the petition demanding Karen step down. One wrote bluntly, "Don't worry, we're all tired of circus. Truth is on your side." I read every line, feeling the momentum of collective will building. And this time, Karen couldn't stop it. Karen chose her last resort, appealing to the local press, trying to frame herself as a woman being harassed by a newly arrived black resident. But the media, instead of siding with her, began to dig deeper. They uncovered old complaints, absurd warning letters Karen had sent to other residents. That record, once exposed, felt like stacking more weight onto her already collapsing stand. I knew this battle was no longer between me and Karen. It had become a clash between truth and deception, between a community demanding respect and someone who treated HOA power like a crown. Karen smeared me, but the evidence was overwhelming, and once the truth stood on my side, she had no way out. The sound of sirens blared at the entrance of Maple Grove Estates, followed by several patrol cars. Karen hurriedly grabbed the arm of a young officer, her voice loud and shrill. "He's illegally locking up my car right inside the garage managed by the community." Her pitch was piercing, as if trying to sway the narrative from the very first second. A few neighbors gathered to watch, the air thick with anticipation. I walked over calmly, holding the folder I had already prepared. Under the curious stares of the residents, I opened the documents and held them up to the officer. "This is the deed to the house and garage, under my name, notarized at the state real estate office." My voice was steady, every word clear, no need to raise it or argue. The officer reviewed the paperwork carefully, his expression shifting from suspicion to unease. He glanced at Karen and asked, "Do you have any proof this garage belongs to the HOA?" Karen flinched, then hastily produced a faded printout with a few lines of internal regulations she had fabricated during a prior meeting. I interrupt. "Please note that the document was never approved under state law, and I have an audio recording of the meeting to prove it." A murmur spread through the crowd. Karen began to unravel, her eyes bloodshot, lipstick smudged from shouting, "He's setting me up to look like the villain. These are my rules. This whole neighborhood follows me." The words slipped from her mouth, unintentionally exposing everything. Some residents chuckled bitterly, others shook their heads in disbelief. One of the officers tilted his head, took notes, and stated firmly, "This garage clearly falls under private property. Entering without permission may constitute trespass." Karen fell silent, her face contorted as she grasped for something to hold on to. "But my car is stuck in there. He can't keep it." I replied calmly, "I'm not keeping it. You drove in yourself, and I simply locked my own garage. If you want it back, wait for a court order. I'm ready to face this openly." My composure was the strongest blow, leaving her seething with rage, yet completely powerless. By now, the crowd of neighbors had grown louder. A middle-aged woman spoke up. "Enough, Karen. She's been using the HOA to feed her personal power trip." Scattered applause broke out, swelling into a wave, echoed down the cries of "Give the community its justice" rang out, prompting even the officers to glance at one another, realizing this was no longer an ordinary civil dispute. The police decided to file a report. They confirmed the property belonged to me, issued Karen a warning for trespassing, and scheduled a follow-up for both parties at the station. Karen stood frozen, her shoulders trembling, mumbling, I was set up. Only this time, no one cared to believe. As the police drove off, I watched Karen leave alone beneath the cold stares of the neighbors. She had once ruled through force and fear, but now stood cornered on the very ground she had treated as her domain. I closed the folder in my hand, a clear sense rising within me, the truth breaking down every last claw Karen had left. I stepped into the house, leaving behind the murmurs outside. But I knew, from the moment the police confirmed the ownership, the entire balance had shifted. Karen hadn't just failed to discredit me. She had put herself directly in the crosshairs of the law. This was only the beginning of the collapse she could no longer avoid. The officer's words rang out clearly, marking the end of the theater Karen had orchestrated for so long. "This is private property. You have no right." His voice firm, definitive, leaving no room for excuse. The words landed heavy and cold, and Karen froze as if the last of her strength had been drained. She stood there, stunned, eyes wide, lips trembling, without a single rebuttal. Years of wielding power, pushing people around, unraveled in an instant before the very residents she used to intimidate. Karen looked like a cracked statue, unable to hold on to the pretense of authority. The air around her stilled for a moment, then turned sharp with the weight of every stare, part tempt, part long-buried anger. A man beside me curled his lips slightly. She just heard it from the cops themselves. Her reign's over. A woman, usually silent, finally spoke. We've let her push us around for too long. It's time we got our just. The whispers grew louder, becoming a heat wave sweeping across the porch, as if the whole neighborhood had awakened from a long sleep. Karen tried to reclaim her voice, but it came out thin and brittle. You don't understand. I did it all to preserve standard, but no one agreed. The words only made her seem smaller. The crowd broke into bitter laughter, and someone snapped back. Standards don't mean dictatorship. She turned left and right, searching for support, but met only cold stares. No one was willing to stand beside her anymore. I watched silently, without needing to speak. The truth had spoken for me, louder than any defense could. I hadn't expected Karen to fall in one blow, but witnessing her unravel in front of the entire community was unforgettable. It was like watching a curtain rip open, revealing a power built entirely on deceit. As the police left, handing over the written report, Karen remained rooted in place, her makeup smeared, fists clenched, with nowhere to go. Some neighbors walked past her without a word, as if she were already a stranger. One door after another shut behind them, leaving Karen alone in the courtyard, facing the same cold disregard she had once so freely handed out. I went back inside, closed the door. Through the window, I could still see her standing under the streetlight, dazed. To me, it wasn't just the fall of one person. It was the liberation of an entire community. Everything she had built, so-called standard, her rule by intimidation, was now just a shattered remnant, unworthy of being picked back up. In that moment, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. When the truth is illuminated, it can silence even those who once believed themselves untouchable. And this time, the truth had chosen Karen as its clearest example. The meeting that day was packed, not a seat left, with many residents lining the hallway. The air was thick with anticipation. Everyone knew this would be the final confrontation that would determine Karen's fate. I stepped up to the long table, placed a stack of documents and audio recordings on the surface, and said calmly but clearly, "This is evidence that Ms. Karen has repeatedly abused her authority, issued unreasonable fines, and even discriminated against residents in this very community." Photocopies were passed from hand to hand. People leaned in to read, then looked up with faces filled with anger and disbelief. The absurd fines stood out plainly. Fined for planting flowers of the wrong color, fined for flying a flag on a Tuesday, even fined for parking inside one's own garage. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. An elderly man stood up, face flushed. "I paid over $500 because my fence didn't match her house. Is this what justice looks like?" Karen jumped up, slamming her hand on the table, voice shrill. "I did everything to maintain standards, to protect everyone's property value. Without me, Maple Grove would have turned into a slum long ago." She scanned the room, hoping for support, but was met only with cold stares. A woman clutching the documents responded bluntly, "Maintaining standards doesn't mean insulting and controlling people. This is a neighborhood, not your personal kingdom." I played the audio. Karen's voice echoed through the room. "In this neighborhood, people like you should learn to adapt." The condescension was unmistakable, the racial undertone clear. Heads shook. Someone muttered, "That's disgraceful." The undercurrent of resentment now surged into open fury. Everyone could see this was no longer about a garage, but about dignity and the rights of an entire community. Karen didn't back down. She shouted, "I'm not discriminatory. These are just general rules." But a young resident, previously silent, stood and asked, "What rule lets you enter someone's home without permission? What rule turns a private garage into public property? These are just excuses for your control." Applause erupted, loud, sustained, and unified. For the first time, the community stood together, openly opposing her. I looked Karen and saw her face from flushed to pale, her eyes wide with panic and nowhere left turned. What used to be her source of power was now a pile of evidence against her. For the first time, Karen was no longer the HOA queen. She was simply a defendant, judged by the very community she once ruled. The meeting continued with wave after wave of testimony. Residents forced to pay unjust fees, others threatened with lawsuits for not complying, and people publicly shamed on this. Each voice landed like an arrow, leaving Karen trembling, her voice breaking. I closed with one simple sentence: "It's time for Maple Grove to break free from this dictatorship. The room was silent for a few seconds, then erupted in applause, chants rising. "Vote! Vote now!" Karen cried out one last time, voice cracking in desperation. "You'll all regret this. I just wanted to keep standards." But no one was listening anymore. The entire room had turned away, leaving her alone, clinging to defenses that no longer held any weight. I watched the scene in silence, knowing that the truth now stood firmly with the community, and Karen, no matter how tightly she clung to the label of upholding standards, could no longer shift the balance that had already tipped. My question rang through the meeting room like a hammer strike, thickening the air with tension. Every eye turned to Karen, but this time there was no trust, no fear left for her, only the fury that had been simmering far too long. I repeated, slow and deliberate, each word meant to carve itself into the minds of everyone there. What kind of standard allows someone to enter another's home uninvited, then treat insulting a black resident as normal? The room erupted in murmurs that quickly swelled into calls for a vote. Some residents who had long hesitated now stood without flinching. A middle-aged woman raised the stack of fines Karen had once issued her and declared loudly, "This isn't a standard, it's tyranny. I vote to remove her." Applause followed like a wave of affirmation. Karen trembled, face pale, her eyes wide with panic. She stammered, You're all betraying the system. Without me, this HOA would fall into chaos." But her words were immediately drowned out by protest. A younger resident snapped back, "The chaos isn't because of us. It's because you decided the rules didn't apply to you." I stood still, silent, letting the crowd speak for itself. The collective strength no longer needed my guidance. It had already taken shape. The chants of "Vote Now" rose, loud and unified. Hands went up one after another, from the elderly who once feared conflict to the young families who'd long stayed silent. No one wanted to live under Karen's rule any longer. She still tried to cry out, "It's all just a misunderstanding. I did it for the common good." But that line only triggered bitter laughter from those who'd endured too much for too long. An older man delivered the final blow. "The common good can't be built on personal oppression." Karen turned toward me, her eyes burning with resentment, her voice caught in her throat. "You incited them. You'll pay for this." I didn't respond, just raised my hand to signal the residents to cast their vote. This time there would be no escape for her. As hands rose in unison, the room erupted. The decision was undeniable. No more explanations needed. Karen stood frozen, hands clutching the edge of the table, unable to grasp how quickly her power had crumbled. In that moment, I didn't feel personal triumph, only relief. Because from this day on, Maple Grove would no longer be bound by fear and the dictates of a woman once called the HOA Queen. The community had reclaimed its voice. People poured out of the meeting room in a rush of conversation, their expressions lighter, their eyes clearer. They understood that this vote hadn't just unseated one person, it had closed the door on a kind of rule that had quietly eroded the trust far too long. Karen remained seated, alone and trembling, but no one turned back to look. The anger had been voiced, and justice had been carried out in the way the community chose. And I knew Maple Grove had just stepped into a new chapter. If you were there, how would you have voted? After the tense meeting, Karen left the room with unsteady step. Those who once gathered around her now dispersed, keeping their distance as if afraid of being dragged down with her. Former allies stayed silent, avoided eye contact, and no one stepped forward to defend her. From the position once held firmly at the head of the table, Karen was now left with only a few loyalists, people who had benefited from her or shared in her influence. But even they looked visibly uneasy, knowing Karen's protection no longer held any value. The Maple Grove community had never been more unified. Residents buzzed with discussion, but this time the tone wasn't fearful or cautious, it was resolute. A woman stated plainly, "If she stays, we'll never have justice." Her words drew nods and sparked a wave of agreement. No one excused Karen anymore. What she had done had crossed far beyond the line of forgiveness. When the decision to suspend Karen was announced, the room went silent for a few seconds, then erupted in applause. Many stood up, seeing it as a victory for the community. Papers were signed on the spot, officially stripping Karen of the HOA authority she once wielded like a weapon. Her eyes were red, but instead of admitting fault, she shouted, "You'll regret this. No one can run this place better than I can." But her words fell into silence. That silence was the final blow to the authority she once imposed. Some residents, previously fined unjustly by Karen, stepped back and looked at her, not with fear, but with pride. They didn't need to retaliate with words. Their votes had said everything. Karen was forced to leave the board, her nameplates and files collected by another HOA staff member. The image of a woman who once barked orders now shrank within the crowd, becoming a scene no one had expected. People no longer saw the HOA, only a tyrant unmasked. In the resident group chat, tone shifted rapidly. Messages that once sat unread now poured in as neighbors encouraged one another and began discussing how to rebuild the community. One wrote, "We just witnessed justice within our reach." Another added, "From now on, the HOA must be transparent. No more personal rulemaking." That consensus created a new energy, one stronger than any fear Karen had ever instilled. Karen retreated to her house, quieter than ever. Neighbors who once nodded to her now turned away, no longer wishing to be associated. That isolation perhaps weighed heavily than any formal punishment. Power stripped, reputation shattered, allies gone. She was left with emptiness. Meanwhile, I stood silently at the back of the hall, watching it all unfold with a sense of relief. I felt no glee, no personal triumph. What I saw most clearly was that this community had reclaimed its voice, and when united, no one can stand above the law. Karen's suspension wasn't the result of one person. It was the decision of a collective determined to end the cycle of injustice. From that moment on, Maple Grove officially emerged from the shadow of a woman who once believed she was the law. She was still there, but no longer at the center. And in the cold silence surrounding Karen's home, the entire community had learned a costly lesson. Those who rule through fear will always end up isolated. The sight of Karen walking out of the meeting room that day became an unforgettable image. She kept her head down, rushed her steps, her shoulders trembling as murmurs spread down the hallway. Someone captured the moment on their phone, and within minutes, the clip had been shared across every neighborhood social. A figure who once sat at the head of the table now appeared as a lonely silhouette, small and out of place amid the applause and cold stare. That image spoke louder than 1,000 words, no commentary needed. On the community forum, comments erupted non-stop. People shared the clip with captions like "fitting end" and "you reap what you sow." Many who had stayed silent before finally spoke up, recounting times when Karen had bullied them, the absurd warning letters that once left them anxious and sleepless. Now, all that fear had transformed into a wave of released outrage. She had become the symbol of a bygone era, and that hunched figure in the clip served as its final punctuation. Karen seemed to understand she had been defeated. For years, she was used to her word being law, her judgments unquestioned. But this time, it was the silence of the crowd that dismantled her false authority. No one objected, no one defended her, only indifferent stares remained. For those who thrive on the fear of others, abandonment, cruelest punishment. I watched it all unfold, but had nothing more to say. I didn't need to rise in triumph or emphasize who had won. The community had seen the truth with their own eyes, and it was they who delivered the final verdict. I chose silence, because sometimes silence is the sharpest blade. It cuts deep into the void that Karen now struggled cling to. After that day, Maple Grove began to change. The atmosphere in the neighborhood grew lighter. People greeted each other with ease in their eyes, no longer fearing absurd fine notices. The clip of Karen with her head bowed continued to circulate, becoming a kind of cautionary symbol. Anyone still harboring illusions about standing above the law could look at that image and understand how quickly it can all collapse in a single moment. Many residents messaged me privately, thanking me for having the courage to stand up and see it through. I didn't respond much, only reminding them that they were the ones who changed the tide. I alone could never have shifted the course, not without a community that collectively chose to stop bowing their head. The strength never lay in one person, but in the unity formed when everyone finally said, "Enough." In my own quiet space, I looked toward Karen's house. The door was shut, the curtains drawn, darkness settling over someone who once made the most noise. It wasn't a victory to be celebrated. Proof justice comes in many forms. Sometimes it's the bang of a gavel in court, sometimes a collective vote, and sometimes a brief clip showing a tyrant lowering her head as she walks out of the room. I didn't need to say more because the truth had already revealed itself, and for me, that was enough. In the days following the fateful meeting, the media began to sniff out a story potent enough to stir public outrage. What started as a minor conflict in Maple Grove was soon branded with a sensational name: Garage War. The phrase spread quickly, appearing in headlines, evening talk shows, and trending hashtags. People grew intrigued by this strange battle, a conflict in which an HOA had somehow sparked full-blown community crisis. Karen suddenly became the poster child for abuse of power. Images of her arguing, pointing fingers, or the clip of her lowering her head and leaving the meeting room were edited, analyzed, and endlessly debated. Journalists dubbed her the symbol of unreasonable control, a woman who believed she could write her own laws above the law itself. Within days, Karen's reputation plummeted from HOA queen to a public laughingstock, cited as the case of corrupted authority. Residents who had endured Karen's rule for years were now interviewed, recounting in detail the unjust fines, the threatening letters, them living in anxiety. Testimonies and memories piled up, sketching a portrait of a woman who didn't know limits. The media explored every angle, from lawyers to sociologists, all pointed to the same conclusion. The Maple Grove incident was a symptom of a larger illness. Too many HOAs had overstepped, turning tools of management into instruments of oppression. On television, one commentator stressed, "The issue here isn't just a garage, it's the disdain for the rule of law." Karen thought the HOA was a court, a police force, even a government, but in truth, it's only a civil administrative body. These remarks further inflamed public sentiment, applying pressure not only on Karen, but also on the broader HOA system across the city. Meanwhile, I watched it all unfold like a spectator. I didn't need to speak up. Truth had already found its voice. The media did its part, the residents did theirs, and justice slowly formed. To me, Karen became living proof that no one can manipulate forever when light is cast into dark. Yet, amid all the noise, one detail stayed with me. People talk, joke, dissect. Few paused to consider the root of it all, how fear had so many silent for so long. Only when Karen slipped up, only when public sentiment swung, did everyone dare to push back. If that clip didn't exist, if the garage door hadn't slammed shut at the right moment, Karen might still be in control, still ruling by fear. That realization made me all the more determined that this story couldn't end as mere entertainment. It had to serve as a warning that silence is complicity. Garage War wasn't just about mocking a power-hungry woman. It was a reminder to everyone that justice must be defended daily, with awareness and courage from each individual. The media could assign labels and residents could cheer. To me, the real victory wasn't in Karen becoming a public spectacle. It was that Maple Grove had finally stepped out of fear's shadow and entered a new chapter. And if someone were to ask what remains after everything, I'd say this: truth, once made public, can't be locked away in any garage. Old clips began to surface, spreading at lightning speed. A resident from a neighboring community shared that they too had once been Karen's victim. They dug up an old video showing Karen berating a Latino family for planting flowers in their front yard without permission, her voice sharp and dripping with disdain. Another clip from the year before showed Karen tearing down a black veterans memorial sign and sneering, "This isn't a cemetery, this is a proper neighborhood." These pieces of evidence were posted across forums, stitched together into a complete picture of Karen's abuse of power and prejudice. People no longer saw her as a polarizing figure, but as someone with a long history of arrogance and injustice. The comments poured in. "This isn't a one-time incident, it's a pattern. She's been acting like this for years and no one stopped her." The press moved quickly, using the clips to produce investigative reports. On the evening news, footage of Karen shouting at neighbors was shown side by side with the clip of her breaking down as Maple Grove residents turned on her. The contrast was glaring, stirring both anger and contempt in viewers. The persona Karen had once cultivated, that of a tough HOA leader upholding standards, crumbled like cheap paint peeled back. In its place, she was cast as a bully, a woman who wielded power to mask her cruelty and bias. Her former allies, once silent, could no longer defend her. Fearing the backlash, some rushed to distance themselves, even adding fuel to the fire by revealing times they were pressured into signing off on irrational decisions. Karen, once backed by an entire apparatus, now stood alone, absorbing a hailstorm of criticism from both the community and the public. On social media, the name Karen became a running joke. Memes showed her with sarcastic captions like "Queen of Made-Up Rule" or "The garage is public, her honor private." The ridicule went viral, turning her downfall into a kind of communal entertainment. But behind the laugh, there was still rage, a delayed reckoning from those she had once oppressed. To me, every clip, every accusation was another nail sealing the coffin of Karen's power. This was no longer a personal battle between her and me. It had become a community indictment against someone who embodied the abuse of authority. And when a reputation is reduced to rubble, there's no patching it back together. She was left to confront the bare truth. False power cannot survive the weight of collective memory. I watched everything in silence. I didn't need to add another word of accusation because the entire community had already spoken for me. From within that quiet, I came to a deeper realization. Justice doesn't always need a courtroom to deliver its verdict. It is carried out when the truth is laid bare, when the memories of those once oppressed rise together in unison. And for Karen, that verdict was harsher than anything any formal counsel could ever hand down. I returned after a long vacation, carrying a sense of relief mixed with anticipation. The quiet house seemed to welcome its owner, and the path to the garage stirred memories of those tense days. When I pressed the remote to open the door, the scene before me made me pause for a few seconds. Karen's car was still there, abandoned inside, its windows and body coated with a thick layer of dust like a forgotten artifact. The faint smell of mildew lingered in the air, proof that it had been trapped far too long, untouched by anyone. I bent down and saw the battery completely dead, the tire marks still imprinted on the concrete floor, a silent record of her recklessness. I stepped closer, gently touched the cold hood, and thought to myself, everything eventually ends up like still and left behind. Karen once thought this would be her weapon to bring me down, but now it had become proof of her bitter defeat. I turned toward the door, took a deep breath, and in that moment, I realized my garage had truly been reclaimed. Not as a prison, not as a battlefield. News of my return quickly reached the neighbors. A few came over, eager to witness it for themselves. They murmured among each other, some chuckling at the dust blanketing Karen's expensive car. An elderly woman sighed. All my years living here, I've never seen anyone turn themselves into such a joke. I simply smiled, letting the image speak for itself. As I looked at the empty garage, I remembered the early days when Karen falsely accused me, painted me as a violator, and tried to make me the offender. All the insult, all the suspicious stares had vanished the moment that garage door opened. The very space she once used as a pretext had now become the symbol of her collapse. And in the eyes of everyone around me, I saw it clearly. This battle had ended with the truth prevailing. I felt no glee, nor did I try to pour salt on a wound already exposed. Instead, I chose silence to savor the relief, because the best retaliation is not in harsh words, but in letting your opponent reveal their own weakness. That dust-covered car stood as a silent verdict, showing how every one of Karen's schemes had turned to ashes. That night, as I sat alone in the yard under the warm glow of the porch light, I realized the garage had been freed in more than just the physical sense. It symbolized my own release, my escape from the dark cloud of oppression. And what made me smile was knowing the community had been freed along with me. No longer did people live under the fear of Karen's nit or her relentless hunt for reasons to punish. They had all seen the truth, and with it, they had gained the courage to stand up for them. I locked the garage, stepped back into the house with a renewed sense of peace. I knew that from now on, this place would no longer be a battlefield, but a safe space, mine, earned through everything I had fought to reclaim. And in the quiet, I whispered a sentence to myself as a quiet affirmation: everything is back where it belonged. I stood before the wide-open garage, the late afternoon light flooding in, casting a glow on Karen's dust-covered car like a vivid symbol of disgrace. A crowd had gathered, everyone eager to witness the conclusion of the story that once stirred up the entire neighborhood. I raised my hand for silence, then spoke plainly and firmly. No embellish, just a simple truth. 10 days of parking, free of charge, because this was a lesson. The crowd burst into laughter, waves of it spreading, interwoven with sarcastic remark. Someone said, an expensive lesson, traded for her reputation. Another added, the price of arrogance, paid in full. In that moment, I felt no triumph, only relief. The resentment built up over time was finally erased by the shared laughter of the community. Karen wasn't there, but her image was clear in everyone's mind. They remembered her nitpicking, her petty reprimands, and now it all converged into one collective laugh, turning the HOA queen into a tragicomic figure in the very play she wrote herself. I knew this scene would spread, retold again and again, becoming an anecdote about abuse of power and its inevitable downfall. A young man nearby blurted out, "What if she tries to start something again?" I smiled and replied calmly, "I won't need to do anything. She's already destroyed her own standing." That simple answer made a few people nod, because they understood Karen's collapse hadn't come from my retaliation, from a truth that couldn't be denied. I looked around and saw familiar faces now changed. Once marked by caution and fear of HOA fines, their eyes now shone with empathy and trust. A young mother pulled her child close and whispered just loud enough for me to hear, "From now on, remember, if someone bullies you, speak up. The truth will be on your side." Her words warmed me, because it was clear this wasn't just about a garage or a car. It had planted a new kind of faith in our community. That afternoon became a milestone. The laughter, the chatter, ease, and everyone's expressions blended into an atmosphere completely unlike the one I encountered when I first moved in. The suspicion was gone. So was the false authority Karen had worn like armor. In its place stood unity and the courage to speak up. I knew then I hadn't fought alone, and that mattered more than any personal victory. After the crowd dispersed, I walked back inside and closed the garage door. That little space, once the source of so much conflict, now echoed only with the remnants of communal laughter. I sat on the steps, watching the sky turn gold with the setting sun, and said to myself, indeed, when truth is revealed, laughter speaks louder than any defense. That night, night, I received a flood of messages from people who had never spoken to me before. They sent words of thanks. Some shared that they too had been bullied by Karen but never dared to push back. Now, seeing her brought down by the light of justice, they had found the courage to step out of silence. I read each line and felt the weight lift from my shoulder, replaced by a quiet conviction that a community, when united and willing to protect one another, no longer needs to bow to injustice. The burst of laughter when I declared, free of charge because this was a lesson, was not just a fleeting moment of satisfaction. It marked a turning point. It transformed what once seemed like a petty dispute into a powerful message. Wrongful authority may frighten people temporarily, but it will eventually be exposed by truth and the strength of the collective. And when that happens, the laughter of the people becomes the death knell of oppression. Karen showed up at my gate on a windless morning, face pale, far cry from the arrogance she once wore. She had no makeup on, her hair a mess, her eyes red and swollen like she hadn't slept in days. I stood still, watching her, feeling no satisfaction, only something that resembled a long, inevitable ending. She walked toward me slowly, her voice trembling as she said, "You destroyed me." I took a deep breath, my gaze calm and steady. "Number, you destroyed yourself," I replied, each word deliberate, neither harsh nor soft, but sharp enough to make her collapse onto the stone bench by the gate. Karen buried her face in her hand, tears falling onto the tiles beneath her as her sobs merged broken breath. I didn't need to say more. The truth was obvious. It was her hunger for power and her arrogance that brought her to ruin. After a while, Karen looked up, her voice hoarse. "I just wanted to keep order in this neighborhood. I didn't expect it to turn into a disaster." I met her eyes, unwavering. Keeping order doesn't mean stepping on others. You wanted control, but you never understood that respect can't be bought. Fabricated rules. My words silenced her, like a truth she'd never dared admit was finally spoken out loud. Neighbors began to pause as they passed, curiosity in their eyes. Some tinged pity. One whispered loud enough for both of us to hear, "If she'd known when to stop, it wouldn't have come to this." Karen turned her face away, but I saw her shoulders tremble, maybe because she realized public opinion had become a mirror reflecting the truth, leaving her nowhere to hide. I decided to end the conversation there. "Do you want a piece of advice?" I asked, my voice still calm. Karen looked at me, red-eyed, waiting in silence. I continued, "Never mistake power for protection. Only how you treat people determines who you are." She bit her lip, but didn't argue. Perhaps deep down, she knew I was right. As I turned to walk back inside, Karen remained on the bench, curled into herself like someone who once believed she was untouchable, but had become nothing more than a hollow figure. I didn't look back. The conversation had said all it needed. The final silence hung heavier than any accusation. The small crowd gradually dispersed, leaving only the soft rustle of wind through the trees. In my mind, my own words echoed, as if stamping the last truth. She destroyed herself, and that was the only truth that mattered. I walked away, each step slow but resolute, leaving Karen slumped on the bench, her eyes vacant. I didn't have to turn around. I could feel the atmosphere around me. The community stood there, those who had once stayed silent under oppression, now watching her with clear contempt. There were no more nods of approval for her so-called HOA rules, only cold dismissal, as if looking at someone who had thrown her dignity into the dirt. I walked past them, hearing the murmurs drifting like wind. "She's reaping what she sowed." A middle-aged man stood with arms crossed, eyes cold and sharp. "She ruled this place for years. Now she's fallen, and she deserves it." A young mother tugged her child's hand, whispering as they walked by, "Remember this, sweetie. Never be like her." These words slipped through the crowd like invisible blades, cutting into the already shredded pride Karen still clung to. I didn't need to add anything. This community was delivering its own verdict. In that moment, I felt the balance of power shift completely. Back then, all it took was Karen walking around with a citation in her hand, and the entire neighborhood would recoil like cornered prey. Now, it was the other way around. She was the one trembling under the gaze of those she once oppressed. I didn't need to lower my voice in warning, didn't need to make a move, because the contempt in the crowd's eyes was a sentence that allowed no appeal. Karen still sat there, head bowed, hands clenched so tightly they had turned white. She wanted to justify herself, but no one was listening. Any word she let out now would only be seen as the desperate whimper of someone defeated. The community was no longer afraid and no longer needed her. They watched in silence, some shaking their head, others scoffing, all carrying the same message. She had dug her own grave. I took a few more steps, the sound of my shoes on the tiles echoing in rhythm with the heavy silence behind me. I knew Karen was trapped in that void now, the same void she had once used to cage others, now swallowing her whole. I didn't feel pity because this collapse wasn't caused by anyone but her own arrogance. When I reached my house, few neighbors walking by gave me quiet nod. No one said a word, but I could see the respect in their eye. It wasn't admiration for a victor. It was acknowledgement for someone who had dared to stand up against injustice. I returned the nod in silence, my heart lighter, knowing I was no longer alone. That night, the neighborhood's social network was still ablaze. Images of Karen walking away in defeat, head hung low, were posted and commented on endlessly. Someone who laughed at others' misery is now the laughingstock, one person wrote. These words cut straight to the truth. False power only exists as long as people are willing to submit. Once fear fades, throne crumbles instantly. I didn't need to join the argument, didn't need to offer more explanation. The community had spoken for itself, and that voice was louder than any piece of evidence I had ever held. Karen, once the HOA queen, had become the symbol of fallen authority, a living example of the price paid for disrespecting human dignity. In my heart, I wondered, did she truly learn anything from this? Or did she simply feel the sting of losing control and grasp desperately at what was left? Whatever the answer, the outcome remained the same. No one wanted to stand with her anymore. Karen could blame herself or search for someone else to fault, but it wouldn't change the truth. The entire community had rejected her. I sat on the porch, watching the evening light settle over the neighborhood. The air was much calmer than in the stormy days before, and I could feel clearly that this peace hadn't come by chance, but through the unity that rose when people stood together. And then I let out a faint smile at the image of Karen, head bowed under the weight of contemptuous stares. One final question echoed in my mind, as if meant for everyone. Do you think Karen deserved this ending? The decision to abolish the HOA's unreasonable rules was passed immediately after Karen was removed from power. The paper that once listed a slew of tedious clauses, from door paint colors to which flowers could be planted in front yard, was now just a meaningless sheet. It was brought out during a community meeting and torn apart to the sound of thunderous applause. No one had to bow their head and sign absurd violation notices anymore. No one had to dread opening their mailbox in the morning to find a threatening letter shoved inside. Even those who had once sided with Karen had to admit that the rules had been crafted only to satisfy her ego, not to protect any shared interest. For the first time in years, the neighborhood felt lighter, as if a heavy stone had been lifted from everyone's chest. Conversations no longer revolved around who had violated what or who would be fined, but shifted toward how to build shared guidelines that truly made people feel at ease. The meetings that followed were nothing like before. Gone were the scenes of Karen standing on a podium, shrieking orders and issuing threats. Instead, every resident was given the right to speak, propose, and debate. One elderly man, silent for years, finally said, "I think we should focus more on safety than on what kind of grass someone had." That simple remark was met with approval, a reminder that the purpose of a community was never to control, to protect one another. There was a visible shift. Smiles were more frequent. Children played freely in their yards without fear of being scolded by Karen for making noise. Families hung holiday lights without worrying about being fined for not meeting standards. Even neighbors who rarely spoke before began to open up. Fear was replaced with a spirit of equality and mutual respect. I looked at it all, feeling a weight lift from my chest. For years, I had watched Karen chip away at freedom, turning the neighborhood into something stifling. But now, people were deciding how they wanted to live, drawing reasonable boundaries for themselves. A young resident laughed and said, "Now this feels like a real neighborhood where people are neighbors, not rulers." Interestingly, even Karen's former close allies began to change their stand. They started attending meetings, no longer blindly defending senseless rules. Some even apologized to the community for having stayed silent or supported her. No one held grudges or lashed out because everyone understood fear had once bound them to Karen. That fear was gone now, and that was the real victory. The changes were small but deeply meaningful. Everyone agreed to form a new oversight committee, ensuring that no single person would ever hold absolute power again. Authority would be fairly distributed, and every decision would be subject to a vote. Residents could submit feedback, even challenge decisions if they felt something was unjust. No one wanted a repeat of the days when someone like Karen could rise up and use power to bully an entire neighborhood. I listened quietly, without adding much. I knew these moments mattered more than any act of retaliation I had ever made. Karen may have lost everything, but what truly mattered was that the community had learned how to protect it. From now on, no one would have to fear a person standing above everyone else. That evening, as I walked past the main road, I saw a few families chatting and laughing together. Porch lights glowed brightly and warmly. No one cared about whether it was up code. A child ran past me, smiling widely. "It's really fun around here now." I nodded gently, feeling the warmth radiate from the very things that once seemed so simple. Karen once planted fear in this community. But now, fairness has taken its place, and I knew this change would last, because once a community learns to rise up, it never willingly returns to the shadows. Many neighbors came up to me after that final meeting, once all the decisions had been made. They approached with sincerity in their eyes, shaking my hand firmly and offering words I had never heard before. "Thank you," a middle-aged woman said, her voice slightly trembling. "Because of you, I no longer have to hide my old car in the garage." A young man laughed, saying he could finally paint his fence the shade of green his daughter liked without worrying about getting fined. Every word meant more to me than any kind of personal victory. A clear shift began to ripple through, not just in official meetings but in daily life. Smiles were exchanged more easily, and porch conversations lost their guarded tone. People were willing to linger longer, ask how others were doing, and share little stories. I realized that when the fear of being controlled disappears, trust begins to return, and from that trust, connection is reborn. One afternoon, as I was parking my bike in the garage, the elderly woman from the end of the street approached, holding a basket of homemade cookies. She smiled and said she wanted to give them to me for doing what so many others had only dared to think. Her voice dropped, her eyes misty. There were times I thought I'd spend the rest of my life in silence under someone else's rule. Now I believe justice isn't some distant thing. Hearing that, I fell silent, realizing that the weight of what I had done wasn't just in defeating Karen, but in restoring belief people who had nearly forgotten they had the right to live freely. The neighborhood gradually took on a new spirit. Children laughed on the sidewalk, bikes zipped down the street without anyone scowling that it was too noisy. Some families hosted small gatherings on their lawns, lights strung between porches. These things seemed simple, but after years of being stifled by strict rules, they felt like gifts. I stood at a distance watching it all, listening to the music in the air, and felt a peace that had been missing for far too long. Some have called me the hero of the neighborhood. I smile at the thought, but deep down, I don't believe I deserve that title. I was simply the first to step forward, while the real strength came from the community, from people who chose never to bow their heads again. Without their unity, none of my efforts would have gone this far. The atmosphere in the neighborhood is completely different. It's no longer the tense silence of the past, but the calm of people finally living in accordance with their right. With each passing day, I see it more clearly. Sometimes, change doesn't require grand gestures. Just one moment where someone dares to say, "Enough." From that moment, others will find the courage within themselves. And so, from a place once known for suffocating control, our neighborhood has become a testament to the power of timely resistance. People no longer speak of Karen as a figure of authority, but as a reminder, a lesson to be remembered. Power only exists when people are afraid of it. Once fear disappears, justice returns on its own. After the storm had passed, I decided to spend most of my time with my family. Dinner returned to what it used to be. No more emergency calls from neighbors or haunting warning letters in the mailbox. I sat with my wife and son, listening to laughter echo through the small kitchen, feeling the warmth that had once been buried beneath endless conflict. My son could now freely draw on the wooden board out front without fear of someone threatening to erase it. That was the moment I truly understood I hadn't just reclaimed just for myself, but for the generations that followed. My garage, once the center of controversy, had now become a symbol of personal right. Neighbors often stopped by, not to argue or scrutinize, but to smile at the gleaming steel door, now a quiet reminder. Some jokingly called it gate freedom, because since truth came to light, it had become synonymous with a sweeping change in our community. I stood and looked at the garage, remembering Karen's defiance, and the moment I firmly locked that door, smiling at the thought that sometimes one bold decision opens a new door for many others. Peaceful days followed one after another, but that didn't mean I forgot the lessons learned. I spent many afternoons talking with neighbors, finding ways to keep the neighborhood fair and to avoid repeating old mistakes. Instead of tense, stressful meetings, we now gather on the grass, drinking tea and truly listening to one another. That sense of connection brought a security no harsh rule ever could. My family changed too. My wife told me that for the first time in years, she felt like this house truly belonged to us, no longer a place where every step had to be measured. My son proudly shared that his friends liked coming over more now because their parents no longer feared being watched or judged. Hearing those words, I knew everything I had gone through was worth it. I understood that peace doesn't come on its own. It is the result of necessary struggle. That garage, once just a small piece of property, had become a symbol no one could deny. It served as a reminder everyone has the right to defend their own space, and that when one person dares to stand up, the whole community can find the strength to change together. Late at night, when everyone else had drifted to sleep, I would often stand by the window, looking toward the garage. The streetlight cast its glow on the steel door, making it look like a quiet, unwavering shield. In that moment, I knew these peaceful days weren't the end, but the beginning of a new way of living, one where fear had been driven out, and trust had finally been put back in its right place. Each time I walked past the garage, I paused, not to check the lock or the steel door, but to reflect on my own memory. A trace of dust still clung to the corner, a silent echo of the moment Karen shouted to have her car released, while the laughter of my neighbors that day still seemed to linger in the air. It hadn't just been a fight with one person. It was a direct reckoning with the kind of false authority that had weighed down this neighborhood far too long. I placed my hand on the cool coat of paint, feeling rising within me that was hard to describe. Whenever I think back, I no longer feel the anger I once did, only the undeniable truth. Silence has never brought. Had I chosen to stay quiet for the sake of false peace, perhaps everyone would still be living in fear of being judged and controlled. The garage became a landmark, not because it locked someone's car inside, but because it opened a new path for the entire community. I smiled to myself, whispering, as if to remind myself, silence never defeats justice. That sentence became an inner vow, a red thread guiding the days ahead. It wasn't just for the past with Karen, but a compass for every decision in the future. I want my son to grow up in a world where speaking up matters more than avoiding trouble, where every person knows their worth cannot be trampled by anyone. Sometimes neighbors would stand with me near the garage, chatting. An elderly woman, once fined by Karen for a flower pot placed slightly off-center, now laughed heartily. Every time I walk past this spot, I feel relieved, like I've escaped a ghost. A young couple said they had decided to stay in the neighborhood instead of selling their house because they believed it had become a place worth living in. Hearing that, I knew the garage was no longer just my story. It had become a symbol of the neighborhood's rebirth. At night, when the city sinks into stillness, I still hear Karen's shouting in my memory, clashing with the calm in my voice as I turned the key to slam the door shut. Between those two extremes, truth had prevailed. I no longer felt the need to argue because justice had already spoken through the consequences she now faced. The community had seen it, had chosen to stand with the truth, and that was everything. I took a deep breath, looked up at the glittering sky, then stepped back inside. In my heart, that battle had ended long ago, but its lessons remained intact. The garage now stands quiet, but to me, it echoes a lasting reminder. When people find the courage to speak, truth will never stay buried. And from that courage, justice finds its path into the light. I know this story will be retold many times, not to shame anyone, but so that everyone in the community remembers false power only exists when we bow our heads and accept. I recount every detail not to boast, but to send a warning. If we allow one person to stand above the law, then tomorrow anyone could become the next victim. The lesson isn't that I defeated Karen, but that the entire community recognized its true worth and had the courage to stand together in defense of it. In later conversations, I often say, justice doesn't come from shouting, but from resolve. Loud anger may shake for a few moments, but it's persistence, clear evidence, and the refusal to back down that ultimately bring falsehood to its knees. I didn't need grand words, just to stand tall, hold firm to my rights, and show everyone that the law is on our side when the truth is revealed. The community changed completely after the ordeal. Meetings that were once heavy and tense became open and transparent. People now question one another openly, no longer afraid of being listed on some absurd violation report. Every glance changed is a quiet reminder, paid the price, and no one is allowed to recreate the old shadow of power. And I know it was that moment when the whole neighborhood bore witness to the forward this last. I close this chapter with a sense of relief, as if putting a final period on a long, tense story. The garage is still there, silent but heavy with symbolism. To me, it's not just a place to park a car, but a living testament that justice can be built from seemingly small acts. To stand up, to speak out, to stay resolute, those three things turned an ordinary person into the spark of transformation. And perhaps the most valuable thing isn't that Karen fell, but that the entire community learned to stand upright. I hope anyone who hears this story remembers that silence in the face of injustice is a form of complicity. When one person dares speak, hundreds more may find the courage in that voice. Justice doesn't need noise to exist. It needs resolve, and it needs people who believe that truth always carries the final power. Karen paid the price for years of abusing her authority, but her downfall wasn't simply the end of one individual. It was like a mirror held up to the entire community, forcing everyone to face the truth that silence had once enabled injustice. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted. People looked at one another not with hesitation, but with a sense of trust, as if sharing a collective memory where they had all watched false power fall. Residents began showing up to meetings in greater numbers, not to be dictated to by one person, but to deliberate together. Voices once drowned out now rang loud, confident, unwavering. People didn't hesitate to bring up the garage incident as a vivid lesson, that anyone can become a Karen if given unchecked power. That vigilance didn't turn into fear, but into a source of unity, a shared strength that taught the entire community how to protect one another. As for me, I realized the most important part of this story wasn't the victory over Karen, but the fact that I was never truly alone. Every time I stood up and challenged her, there were eyes in the crowd offering silent support, subtle nods, whispers of, "You're right." When I locked the garage, it may have seemed like a personal act, but it triggered a ripple effect that shook the entire fabricated system. Justice is never a one-person effort. It begins with one small act, then grows as the community lifts it, spreads it, and turns it into collective power. I came to understand more deeply that when we defend justice, we are never truly alone. There may be silence at first, but that silence doesn't equal agreement. It's merely waiting to be broken. And once that voice breaks through, others will find the courage to join in. One by one, step by step, the wall of false power crumbled, exposing the true foundation underneath: the law, fairness, and human dignity. The story didn't end in triumph, but in clarity. Karen collapsed, the community changed, and I knew I had grown too through the course of this battle. From that small garage, I learned that courage isn't about shouting, it's about holding the line for what's right. And on that path, the most valuable realization was this: in the fight for justice, we're never alone. Even if others step forward slowly, once they do, they'll stand with you until the end. The story began with a garage, a place where Karen believed her HOA power could be imposed on everyone. Through threats, arrogance, and senseless rules, she believed residents would stay silent and bow their head. But this time, it wasn't just a small matter. When her car was trapped in the garage, when her screams echoed into emptiness, the entire community saw the truth. Karen's so-called authority was nothing more than a thin shell, easily shattered when met with evidence and resolve. Day by day, the story spread, becoming the now infamous garage war covered endlessly by the press. What started with one person standing up sparked a wave of defiance across the neighborhood. Neighbors who had once been hesitant began to ask questions. If an empty garage could be claimed as communal property, then what about home? Do our private spaces belong to the collective too? Those questions laid bare the absurdity and exposed Karen's true nature for all to see. When the police arrived, every false accusation she had made crumbled in the face of undeniable truth. Karen could no longer use power or manipulation to cover things up, and her silence before the community that day became the harsh sentence of all. From that moment, every fragment of the false authority she had built over the years was exposed. Allies turned their back, residents voted her out, and the media uncovered her record of discrimination and abuse. Karen left with her head bowed, her reputation shattered, becoming a laughingstock on the very stage she once used to command control. But the deeper meaning didn't lie in Karen's downfall. It lay in the transformation of the community. People realized that prolonged silence only creates room for wrongdoing to grow. And once someone dares to speak up, other voices will rise. The absurd regulations were abolished. Residents began discussing matters more democratically, and the garage that had symbolized conflict now stood as proof of justice's strength. The lesson left behind is crystal clear. Justice doesn't come from bursts of anger, but from unwavering resolve and the courage to confront what's wrong. Sometimes a single act is enough to open the door for an entire community to change. And most importantly, when you walk the path of defending justice, you are never truly alone, because there will always be eyes watching, voices rising, and people ready to walk beside you. What began as a seemingly trivial battle became a testament. False power can intimidate for a while, but it will inevitably collapse when faced with the truth. And when the truth is finally spoken, it doesn't just free one individual, it liberates an entire community from fear, helping them understand that dignity and justice are always worth defending to the very end.